Sewenhniseriióhak. Hope everybody's okay. I wanted to do this capsule today touching on the brief history of our lands. I wanted to make it clear before we start, there was never any surrender sought. The lands belonged to every Kanesatake equally, and that the lands were not for sale then and they are not for sale today. So I have to make it clear that, well, within the history here, according to the pottery shards that we find at Oak Park, our presence here dates back over 2,000 years. So our people have seen a lot of changes in that time. So we skip to some of the more pertinent times. Prior to 1700s, there was constant war between the nations at the time. And eventually what happened is that there was what they called the Great Peace of 1701. The 8 nations, including Niawenhkó, Agwizasne, and Kanesatake, made peace with the other nations, traded with the French, and traded with the other First Nations. So at this time they lived in relative peace until about 1760s, but I'll touch on that in a minute. Around 1717, the French king decided that he was going to make sure that our people were protected, that we were going to be Christianized, showed modern farming techniques. But within that agreement of 1717, creating what was called the Seigneurie, it was in the document, it is in the documentation, that the intent was that if the savages or the Indians should leave the land shall revert back to me. Well, we never left the land, we're still here. So the intent was not to give the Sulpicians any title whatsoever. They were acting as trustees on our behalf. So 1717, and the Seigneurie is created, and we start living in peace, raising our families. But during those periods, we see epidemics. We see our people getting very sick. And this went on for another 150 years. So we go on to 1760. The British are moving in on the French. They have one last fight, the fight at Montreal. So the Treaty of Oswegatchie was very important there. The British were moving in. They wanted us to remain neutral. So Agwizasne, Niawenhkó, Kanesatake, we all sent our representatives to Oswegatchie. This is where our chief at the time, Anayeta, according to the histories, was a Christian chief, and many of his people. And at the Treaty of Oswegatchie, he traded wampum belts with Sir William Johnston, the British Crown representative, affirming the title and the rights of Kanesatake to the lands of the said Seigneurie. This is really important because Chief Anayeta, being a Christian, governed under his custom, as we've done since. So 1760, after the defeat of the French, the Articles of Capitulation come out. Article 40 was very important. Article 40 says that we are not to be molested under any pretense whatsoever, and that we're to be kept in the lands we occupied and keep our hunting grounds. So this was reaffirmed in the Treaty of Peace of Niawenhkó, and we see a couple of years later the Royal Proclamation, 1763, which reaffirms the British King's commitment, his promises that we were to be kept in our lands and kept in peace. Now, a year later, the British representatives decided to convene a meeting at Niagara, where the Treaty of Niagara comes out, and again it was reaffirming those promises of the British King. So title of the land, benefits of the land, so on. Now we move on. Now about 1841, the Ordinance of Montreal comes out. The Sulpicians had been lobbying the British Crown for some time and demanding that their title be asserted. Now there's a lot of details going back into that, but I won't go into those. The fact was that they tried to get their rights and titles asserted in 1841 in the 1841 Ordinance. But according to modern legal opinion, it failed to extinguish Aboriginal title. So we move on a little further. A few decades later, we see Joseph Swan, Onasakenrat. Onasakenrat becomes the chief. But prior to that, he was also a student of the Sulpician order. He was being groomed to become a priest. But during those studies, he discovers the documents that affirmed Kanesatake's title to the land, not the Sulpicians. So he moved on, becomes chief, and convinces a majority of his people to leave the Catholic Church and go towards the Protestant or the United Church. That's where a lot of these problems began for Joseph Swan and others. And what happened with Chief Swan, when he was trying to enlarge his garden within the small commons, or even trying to chop wood with other men, they were promptly arrested and brought to Saint Scholastique for trial. Well, we all know the stories. He was in prison with Louis Réal at one point, and they exchanged ideas. Chief Swan spent some time in prison. Now, during those times, after Joseph Swan had turned his back against the Catholic Church, I see it in the documentation where the Sulpicians decided to punish our people by surrendering or giving to the Trappe Monks almost 1,000 acres of our land. In the documentation it says to punish the apostate savages for turning their backs on the church. So that was one other item in our history why we lost certain parcels of land. But later on, he never gave up on the fight for the lands. So we all know the popular story where he was invited to Montreal for a banquet in his honor, and he was dead the next day. According to the documents, the historical documents, his wife affirms that the possibility that he was poisoned. So we look at a lot of suppression and even murder just to safeguard the titles that didn't belong to anybody but us. So we move on in time. After Joseph Swan passed away, there was Chief Corinthe. Chief Corinthe around 1912 gets into a land dispute with the Sulpicians. It winds up all the way at the Privy Council of England. Arguments are made. The Privy Council gives an opinion, and only an opinion. They said that they believed that the Sulpicians had title to the land and could dispose of it how they saw fit. But they also said, it seems to us that some form of trust exists here, and that the Privy Council is not the proper forum for these arguments and should be brought back to the proper Canadian courts. So from 1912 till now, this was never done. So we go ahead, 1945. The Sulpicians surrender what interest they had left for $1 to the federal government, to the federal crown. And this is where the Oka letters come from. So from then on, anytime we wanted to parcel out land, we had to get an Oka letter. Everybody knows this. So from 1945, this situation remains. But to the frustration of many of our councils since, because they had been fighting for the title of the lands, and the federal government kept asserting that it was not ours to be granted, which was not true. So all efforts from then on, from one council to another, have tried. And now we see at one point in 1990 where the frustration and the anger just exploded. Enough was enough. Ever since then, one council after another has tried without much success. There have been some lands acquired, but it still falls very much short. So we find ourselves today going into these negotiations again. And I have to repeat, the lands are not for surrender. They were never for sale then. They are not for sale now. And the title of those lands that we're fighting for belong to everyone. Shateionkwáwen. Shateionkwáwen belongs to us all equally. So my purpose here is to set the groundwork, at least some comprehension of what it is I have in mind, what I've learned and using at the claim table. So we'll discuss that at the next video. So I appreciate your time and hope to talk to you soon about this. Niawenhkó. Ona.